We preached on Ezra on Sunday morning and then went to Nehemiah. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are all together and need to be taken as a trio of books. And that's how I'm going to approach it. Actually, even though that Esther comes after Nehemiah in the Bible, her story is between the two, Ezra and Nehemiah. Her story happens right between the two. She also was the queen of a Persian king. We know it's a beautiful story about Esther, a woman of great courage, a woman of prayer and faith in God, and how she was chosen as a queen. Of course, most of you know the history of it. It was very interesting. But the whole three books cover a period of time actually after 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, we still got to get to that. The reason I went ahead with these is because that's the order they came in for this month, and you actually had some of those in your reading already. But historically speaking, let us again emphasize where we're at as far as where the nation is at. You'll remember that after King David died, he turned the kingdom over his son Solomon. And Solomon expanded the kingdom and made it wealthy. And they were a nation at peace, whereas David's nation was always at war, although David had a big nation. And after Solomon died, he had a son by the name of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam did not follow after his father in keeping the people happy. And even Solomon in his old age was actually not keeping the people happy. But he was starting to put heavy burdens on the people, tax burdens and everything else, because he lived so wealthily trying to keep those 1,000 wives up. And Rehoboam had a conversation with a man by the name of Jeroboam. Sounds like they're brothers. They weren't. Jeroboam worked for Solomon. And Jeroboam is the one that's going to eventually lead the war effort and divide the nation. But before he did that, Jeroboam went to Rehoboam. He says, "Your dad's dead now." He said, and he was a leader among the 10 tribes except for Judah and Benjamin. Judah was the largest tribe where Jerusalem was. And he went to Rehoboam and he said, "Now, if you'll not impose on the people the things your dad did, if you'll just not put so many burdens on them like your dad did, you'll have all of these 10 tribes with you." And so Rehoboam said, "Well, I'll consult and we'll get back to you." And he did consult. He went to Solomon's advisors, older men, and Rehoboam asked them, "Jeroboam came to me and wanted me to not put so many burdens on the people." He said, "What should I do?" And Solomon's advisors said, "You'll have the people on your side if you will do what he says. If you will lower the taxes and not burden them so much," he said, "you'll win their hearts and you'll have them." So he listened to their advice, and then he had his own advisors. Of course, he was young, and they were young too. And the young advisors said to Solomon, when he asked them what he should do, because of what Jeroboam asked him, they said, "You tell them that if they thought it was bad under your dad, it's going to be worse with you." If you thought the burden was heavy then, you're really going to have some burdens now. Well, guess what he chose? Do you think he chose the wisdom of the older ones or the foolishness of the younger ones? The younger. And he told the people then just what his advisors said. So they rebelled. Jeroboam led the 10 northern tribes and separated the country. It became known as Israel. Rehoboam himself had the 2 southern tribes, which would be Judah and Benjamin. Land-wise, Judah was the largest of all the tribes. So it became simply known as Judah. Israel and Judah. Well, Israel kept getting more and more wicked because they started out with idolatry. Jeroboam put up 2 calves at Dan and Bethel, and they said, "These are your gods now." And one of the reasons he did that was politically. He didn't want them going back to the temple at Jerusalem and worship and be part of the feasts, because he figured they'd, come back to Rehoboam. So there's about 39 kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. Every single king was wicked because they all followed Jeroboam's religion. Down south in Jerusalem, there were a lot of kings as well, about that many, 37. And many of the southern kingdom kings were good, but some of them were really bad news also. So this is what happened. Because the northern kingdom was so idolatrous and so wicked, God allowed the Syrian Empire to come and take them into captivity. About 100 years later, God is going to punish the southern kingdom. And he's going to let the Babylonian Empire come in and take them into captivity. Now, in these books, there's a new empire. It's called the Persian Empire. And Cyrus is the first king of it. One of the characteristics of the Persian Empire is that they were much more kind to the people that they took over than both the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Because you see, and you'll remember through the Bible history, both the Assyrians and the Babylonians came in and took many of those people and deported them to their own country. Just like they did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel and others. However, the Persian approach was different. When they took over a country, they allowed the people to stay. Now, I'm sure they took over their government and that type of thing. And if they were cooperative, some of the people there could be in the government. But they were much more compassionate. As you remember from Sunday, Cyrus, who freed these people from Babylonian captivity, after they were there for 70 years, he took over Babylon, and it became Persia. He freed them, and he let them go back to their homeland. And that's where Ezra and Nehemiah in particular come in at. They go back to the homeland. Ezra's a priest. He sets up all the religious stuff again because the temple was in ruins. Nehemiah, as we noticed, was a cupbearer to the king of Persia, which is a very prominent position. He heard that thing. So this was years later between Ezra and Nehemiah. And he goes back and sets things in order again. So that's where we're at. Nehemiah has been placed by King Artaxerxes, the Persian, as the governor of Judah. Now the problem is this. Back in Judah, they already had leaders. And they didn't like the Jews coming back. Two of the main ones that we see here in the scriptures that we read about a lot was Tobiah, and they were constantly harassing the people, threatening the people by saying that they were going to tell the king Artaxerxes that they were trying to take over the country. So in verse 10 of chapter 2, you'll notice that there's another man, Sanballat. Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard about this, heard about Nehemiah coming back from Persia and setting things in order again. They were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Yet that was supposed to have been their job, to promote the welfare of the Israelites. But they didn't. So they did all these various things to intimidate them, to send letters to the king of Persia that that Nehemiah was starting a rebellion. And we noticed in chapter 4, when we left off Sunday night, that there was opposition to the rebuilding of the temple. And we notice in verse 11, I'll just mention it again, in chapter 4, we already talked about it, I'm just going to mention it before I go on to 5. Nehemiah says, also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work. So they already intimidated them, threatened them, and sent letters to the king of Persia. Now their motive was to kill him. But in verse 15, Nehemiah said, when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. And remember how they had to work. Does anybody remember the unique way that they had to work? Huh? Tools in another. Their weapon in one hand and tools in another. But we left off the sermon on Sunday night from verse number 20. Nehemiah said, our God will fight for us. And he did. But now we're going to see in chapter 5 how Nehemiah helps the poor people. Now Nehemiah was very compassionate. He wasn't like the normal Persian king or even Babylonian king or Assyrian king. Even though he was the governor, he did not take advantage of the people. He said himself, and this is in verse 14 of chapter 5, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah until his 32nd year, 12 years of King Artaxerxes is talking about, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to the food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But notice his faith. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself. Here he was a governor, and he went out and did physical work on the wall. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled here for the work. We did not acquire any land. He took nothing from the people. The king of Persia gave him, the Artaxerxes gave him many things that he needed to get set up financially and so on. But get this. Chapter 5 is talking about Jewish people taking advantage of other Jewish people. You had a segment of Jewish people, those that were working on the wall, with tools in one hand and weapons in another. So they were both warriors and builders. They were working on the wall. They could not do other work and pay their bills. So what do their fellow Jews do? We'll give you food. You just give us your children as slaves. Now, Nehemiah got really mad about that. And there's other things he gets mad about too. Let's read about it. In verse 1 of chapter 5, now the men and their wives raised a great outcry. Now, these are the ones who are being taken advantage of against their fellow Jews. Drop to verse 3. Others were saying, we are mortgaging our fields. They were mortgaging their own property to get enough money to eat for them and their children, while these others were suing them, their own brothers. We're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, our homes to get grain during the famine. Still others, verse 4, were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards, although we are all the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we're powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. Their fellow Jews took them. Now, notice Nehemiah's reaction in verse 6. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. So this is one of the things that Nehemiah did. Some of the Jews were slaves to the Gentiles living in the land, and Nehemiah used some of the money that was given him by the king to buy them back. He said, now you're selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us. They keep quiet because they could find nothing to say. That's the people who are guilty. Now, his anger worked. The people felt guilty and changed their ways. Look at verse 9. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? The reaction of the people is in verse 12. We will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Now, dropping down, he goes ahead and gets people that are officials to sign a paper for all the people that are doing this, that they will not continue to harm their own. At this, look down in verse 13, the latter part. The whole assembly said amen and praised the Lord, and the people did as they promised. Verse 14, moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and I already read this, when I was appointed governor, and he said, I didn't take any food from the people. I didn't even take any land. In fact, he goes on to say in verse 17, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. The food on his table was provided by the king of Persia, and he let his officials eat that food while the people took the other food for themselves. And so he says in verse 19 in chapter 5, remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. And so in chapter 6, we'll get to next time, and we'll be able to finish this book, because we're going to see how they again try to kill. They have a plot to kill Nehemiah. They want him, and I'll tell you just this much, and I won't tell the whole story. They want him to go to the temple. And they say, you'll be safe there. We'll work out some terms of agreement and all, and etc. And he's on to it. He said, no, you've taken me to the temple to kill me. That's what you're trying to do. And, of course, he is very wise. He's a very good man, very prayerful man. And, you know, I mentioned to you how he prayed before he went to the king Artaxerxes to let him know how sad he was over what was going on in Jerusalem and how he wanted to take a leave of absence. It says that he took 4 months, prayed 4 months to approach the king that he was cupbearer to. So he's a great man of prayer, and you'll notice that many times in his book if you haven't read it yet. He really devoted himself to prayer. We'll stop. Does anybody want to say anything about that section of Scripture?